There comes a moment, an undeniable, soul-piercing moment when the person who ran, the one who hid behind silence, distance, and defense mechanisms finally feels it. That tug, that ache, that truth. And let me tell you something, that moment, it's not weakness, it's awakening. Because here's the truth, avoidance is armor. It's what we put on when the world taught us love isn't safe, when connection came with conditions, when vulnerability once got punished. So we learn to run, to withdraw, to shut down before someone else shuts us out. But life has a beautiful way of cracking that armor when the right person shows up. And maybe that person is you. You didn't chase. You didn't beg. You stood tall in your value. You showed love not through clinging, but through presence, consistency, and truth. That's what breaks through. Not control, not fear, authenticity. Because no one wants to feel broken forever. Even the avoidant, especially the avoidant. At some point, the silence becomes deafening, the distance becomes suffocating, the stories they told themselves to stay safe, they stop working, and the one person they pushed away, you, becomes the one they can't stop thinking about. And when that day comes, it's not a time for ego. It's not about revenge or I told you so. It's about power, not over them, but in you. Power to choose, power to lead with love or walk with clarity, power to set boundaries that aren't walls but doors, doors that only open when both people are ready to meet each other with truth. Listen, love isn't a game of who needs who more. It's not about fixing anyone. It's about witnessing transformation. And when someone who ran finally stops, when they finally see you, not through fear, but through clarity, it's because your light never dimmed, just because they couldn't see it before. So stand in that light. Don't shrink. Don't shift to fit their comfort. Stay whole. Because when the avoidant finally realizes they need you, they're not just seeing you, they're seeing themselves for the first time. And that's when everything changes. Avoidant behavior often looks cold. It looks distant, dismissive, even careless. But what it really is, underneath the surface, is self-protection. It's not who they are. It's what they learned to do in order to feel safe. Avoidants weren't born that way. They were shaped, conditioned. Somewhere along the line, through abandonment, emotional neglect, or inconsistent love, they received a message. Closeness equals danger. Vulnerability leads to pain. Neediness is weakness. So what did they do? They armored up. That armor shows up in many forms. Ghosting, shutting down, changing the subject when emotions rise, intellectualizing feelings instead of feeling them. It's not that they don't have emotions, it's that they're terrified of what might happen if they fully experience them. So they retreat, they run, they minimize. But here's the truth. Avoidance is a strategy, not a personality. It's a coping mechanism, not a permanent label. And that distinction is everything. Because when the avoidant finally realizes they need you, it's not that they've suddenly become someone else. It's that the armor is cracking. The strategy is no longer serving them. The fear of connection is finally outweighed by the cost of losing it. This is why your understanding, not your tolerance, not your self-sacrifice, but your wisdom, is so powerful. Because you start to see their walls not as personal attacks, but as deeply rooted survival tactics. But that doesn't mean you fix them. It doesn't mean you wait forever. It means you understand this. Avoidance is not their truth. It's their shield. And when the shield drops, even if only for a second, it's because your presence proves safer than their patterns. That's the real transformation. Not when they change for you, but when they choose to drop the armor for themselves. And that's exactly where your role becomes undeniable. Not as the rescuer, but as the anchor, because your steadiness, your calm and unwavering self-respect is what begins to challenge their entire belief system about love. You see, the avoidant expects inconsistency. They expect chaos. They expect to be either chased or abandoned. That's the cycle they know, the cycle they trust, even if it hurts them. But then you showed up and you didn't fit the pattern. You didn't chase when they pulled away, but you also didn't close the door in bitterness. You stayed rooted in your truth, present but not pleading, available but not dependent. That steadiness, it speaks louder than any words, louder than any apology they were never ready to give. It starts to shake the very foundation of their armor, because now they're faced with a terrifying possibility that real connection doesn't have to feel like sacrifice, that being seen doesn't have to mean being hurt, and that someone can love them without trying to own or fix them. And in that realization, their nervous system begins to feel something it hasn't felt in a long time: safety. Not the safety that comes from isolation or avoidance, but the safety of being witnessed by someone who isn't trying to control them. That's the moment the emotional tide begins to turn. And it didn't happen because you pushed, it happened because you held. Because your emotional gravity, your ability to stay calm in their storm, gave them a blueprint for a different way to connect, one where love isn't fused with fear, one where space doesn't mean punishment, one where presence doesn't require performance. That's your power, and it doesn't scream, it doesn't demand, it just is. The avoidant finally sees that your strength wasn't in how much you needed them, but in how clearly you saw yourself, with or without them. And what's even more powerful is that your steadiness continues to speak, even in your absence. Because here's the truth. Realization doesn't usually hit the avoidant when you're standing right in front of them. It lands in the silence, in the space, in the moments when there's no one left to distract them, no noise left to drown out the ache. That's when it starts. When the phone doesn't ring, when the message doesn't come, when they expect you to chase like everyone else did, but you don't. That quiet, it's deafening. It confronts them. It forces them to sit with everything they tried to avoid. And the worst part for them, the part that cuts the deepest, is realizing that your silence isn't coming from anger or manipulation. It's coming from peace. And that's what scares them most, because now you're not just someone they distance themselves from. You're someone who learned to live without needing to pull them close. That kind of detachment from someone who once loved them deeply, it shatters the illusion that they could keep one foot in and one foot out forever. They start to feel it in ways they can't explain. Your absence lingers. It shows up in the places you once filled. The conversations are quieter. The victories feel emptier. The distractions don't soothe like they used to. And now, for the first time, they're not running from you. They're running into themselves. They're hearing the echoes of your voice in the silence they once craved. And it no longer feels like freedom. It feels like loss. Because now the very space they thought they needed has become the very space that reveals the depth of what they've let slip away. That's the irony. They had to lose your presence to truly see its power. And in that hollow space, something even deeper begins to happen. It's no longer just about missing you. It goes beyond that. They start confronting themselves. The absence becomes a mirror, reflecting back everything they've avoided feeling for years. All the wounds they never faced, all the truths they buried beneath their armor, all the fears they masked with distance. Suddenly, it all rises to the surface. Because what they're grieving isn't just your presence, it's the version of themselves they were with you. The version that felt seen, understood, accepted, not in spite of their flaws, but with them. And when you're gone, they're not just alone, they're exposed. There's no one left to absorb their emotional disconnection, no one to give without demanding, no one to remind them quietly and consistently that love doesn't have to be earned through control or withdrawal. That's when the weight of it hits. They don't just want you back. They want the safety they felt in your presence, the permission they had to be imperfect without fear of being abandoned. But now they're forced to realize that the very love they pushed away was the one thing that had the power to help them reconnect to the parts of themselves they disowned. And that's the moment where regret meets revelation, where they finally see that losing you wasn't just about losing a relationship. It was about losing a chance to become the person they were too afraid to be. Because you weren't just a partner, you were a mirror. And now, without that mirror, they're staring into the raw truth of their reflection for the first time. It's not easy, it's not comfortable, but it's necessary, because sometimes the breakdown is the beginning of the breakthrough. And when that breakthrough finally begins, when they feel the pull to return, to reach out, to admit what they never had the courage to face before, that's the moment everything hangs in the balance. Because this isn't about validation. This isn't your cue to prove you were right all along, or to collect an apology like a trophy. No, this is the moment where your growth gets tested. This is where you realize that real power doesn't come from someone finally needing you. It comes from you no longer needing them to need you. That's the shift. It's no longer about ego, it's about empowerment. Because now you're not the same person who once waited, who once hoped they'd see your worth. You've evolved, you've healed, you've reclaimed your center. So if they return, they're not meeting the version of you that once tolerated confusion and breadcrumbs. They're meeting someone who knows what alignment feels like, someone who doesn't confuse love with pain or connection with chaos. And here's the truth, your worth was never in question, only their readiness was. You never had to prove your value, it was always there. What's changed is your awareness of it. So if they come back, it's not a victory parade, it's a crossroads, a sacred one, where you get to ask yourself, does their return honor my evolution or tempt me to shrink back into the version of me that waited? Because this is where the most important choice happens. Not for them, but for you. You get to decide whether this connection can rise to meet you or if it simply reminds you how far you've come. Either way, you're not driven by hurt or fear anymore. You're led by clarity. And that clarity, that's the real power. And with that clarity comes one of the most misunderstood yet powerful expressions of self-love, your boundaries. Because now you know they're not walls meant to keep people out, they're doors meant to invite in only those willing to knock with intention, not entitlement. Your boundaries are not punishment. They're not cold or harsh or unforgiving. They're simply the truth you've built from everything you've learned. And when the avoidant returns, drawn not by guilt but by realization, they'll meet these boundaries. Not as resistance, but as requirements. Requirements for presence, for honesty, for mutual emotional responsibility. They may not be used to it, they may still feel the impulse to retreat when intimacy demands depth, but now instead of bending to avoid the discomfort, you hold the line. And that line isn't rigid, it's strong. It says, I'm here, but I no longer abandon myself to keep someone else comfortable. That's the energy they never expected, the love that doesn't chase or collapse, but calls forward. And if they're ready, truly ready, your boundaries won't scare them. They'll guide them. They'll reveal the standard, not the struggle. Because you're not asking for perfection, you're asking for presence. You're not demanding guarantees, you're requiring truth. And in that space, something remarkable happens. They begin to see that love doesn't have to mean surrendering self, that boundaries aren't rejection, they're invitations into a healthier, fuller kind of connection. And if they're not ready to meet that invitation, you won't force it, you won't explain it, you'll simply move with grace. Because you're no longer interested in shrinking to be understood, you've become someone who values peace over patterns, and your boundaries, lovingly held, are the compass that protects that peace. And that's where the next truth comes in, the one that frees you on the deepest level. You are not responsible for their healing. You never were. You may have sparked the awareness, you may have held up the mirror, you may have offered the safest place they've ever known, but the work is theirs. The inner reckoning, the rewiring of old beliefs, the courage to sit in discomfort and not run from it, that can't be done for them. You can't love someone into wholeness if they're still committed to their wounds. And no matter how much potential you once saw, no matter how clearly you knew their heart beneath the armor, you've learned that love without self-accountability becomes emotional labor. And that's not your role anymore. Because what you've built in yourself isn't just strength, it's discernment. You now understand that compassion doesn't mean carrying what's not yours, that empathy doesn't require sacrifice, that being loving doesn't mean being a landing pad for someone's unprocessed pain. So if they're finally waking up, if they're finally willing to do the work, that's a beautiful thing, but only if it's not contingent on you doing it with them. You can support, you can encourage, you can witness, but you don't carry, you don't fix, you don't stretch yourself thin to make healing more convenient for them. And when you operate from that place, when your love becomes rooted in truth instead of obligation, it transforms the entire dynamic. You're no longer tangled in their journey. You're walking your own, inviting them to meet you at the level of integrity, not emotional dependency. And if they do, there's space for something real to grow. But if they don't, you won't crumble, because you've already built within yourself what you once tried to find in them. And with that awareness comes a quiet but unshakable knowing, the understanding that your worth was never the issue. It wasn't your love that lacked, it wasn't your effort that failed, and it wasn't your presence that pushed them away. It was their capacity, their readiness, their ability to receive what was in front of them without needing to sabotage it to feel safe. You see, when someone isn't ready to meet you in the fullness of what you offer, they'll tell themselves stories to make sense of the disconnect. They'll convince themselves you're too much, or that they're better off alone, or that they don't need anyone. But deep down, they weren't rejecting you. They were rejecting the vulnerability that your love demanded of them. Because real intimacy exposes everything they've spent years trying to hide. And when you bring that level of truth to someone who isn't ready, it can feel threatening. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you made them feel seen. And being seen can be terrifying to someone who hasn't made peace with themselves. But now that the noise has settled and the mirror is still standing, they begin to understand. It wasn't that you asked for too much, it's that you were offering what they weren't ready to hold. And that changes everything. Because now, instead of internalizing their fear as a reflection of your value, you recognize it for what it is, a gap in timing, not a deficit in worth. You stop taking their avoidance personally. You stop questioning your instincts. You stop editing yourself to fit their comfort zone. And in doing so, you reclaim the parts of you that were never meant to be negotiated. So when they finally come back with clearer eyes, maybe even a humbled heart, you're no longer starving for their recognition, because you already know what they're just starting to realize, that your love was never the problem. It was a mirror they had to be brave enough to face. And what truly holds all of this together, what made the greatest impact without force or demand, was your presence. Not pressure, not persuasion, not manipulation, just presence. The calm, unwavering energy that said, I'm here and I know who I am. Because when someone lives in avoidance, they're used to being pulled, pushed, or provoked. They brace for the drama, they expect the chase. But when none of that came from you, when you simply stood in your truth and allowed them the space to choose, you gave them a rare and powerful gift, sovereignty. You didn't try to control the outcome. You didn't beg for clarity. You let your silence speak, not as a weapon, but as a boundary. You showed that real love doesn't demand, it invites. And that kind of love is unforgettable. Because presence is magnetic. It doesn't shout, it doesn't plead, it simply is. And in a world full of noise, that kind of stillness becomes deafening. They start to realize that while they were trying to gain control by pulling away, you were demonstrating a higher kind of strength by not reacting. And that's what lingers, that's what replays in their mind long after the conversations have stopped. Your presence taught them more than any confrontation ever could. It showed them a different model of love, one rooted in self-respect, depth, and emotional maturity. And now, they're left with the quiet truth that the very thing they once ran from is the thing they now long for. Not because you pressured them into needing you, but because you showed them how powerful it feels to be around someone who doesn't need to force anything to prove their value. You didn't try to earn their love. You embodied your own. And that's what shifted the dynamic. That's what turned the silence into a mirror, the space into a lesson, and the distance into an awakening. Your power wasn't in trying harder. It was in standing still, rooted, complete. And now they see what they couldn't before, that the connection they thought they could walk away from was the very one that taught them what real love actually looks like. So now, here you are, clearer, stronger, and no longer waiting for someone else's awakening to validate your journey. Because the truth is, this was never just about whether they would return. It was about who you became while they were gone. It was about your evolution, your rising, your refusal to dim your light just because someone else needed time to adjust their eyes to its brightness. And yes, maybe they finally realize they need you. Maybe they're ready now. But the question is no longer, do they want me? The real question is, does their return align with the life I've built in their absence? Because love isn't measured by who comes back, it's measured by how deeply you refuse to abandon yourself again. And whatever you choose next, let it come from your highest self, not your history. Let it honor your healing, not your hurt. Because the version of you who once needed their validation is gone. And what stands in their place now is someone unshakably whole.